Well, good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Patient Recruitment in Oncology Trials, Understanding the Patient's Perspective. My name is Andrew Jordan, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. And today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes with time for a question and answer session with our speakers. And this webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars really work best when you are involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and your comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box. And we'll try to attend to those questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel that's on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using that chat panel. And at this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. So please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. And at this point, I'd like to thank Syneos Health, who developed the content for this presentation. Syneos Health is the only fully integrated biopharmaceutical solutions organization. The company, including a contract research organization and a contract commercial organization, is purpose-built to accelerate customer performance to address modern market realities. Created through the merger of two industry-leading companies, INC Research and Inventive Health, they bring together approximately 24,000 clinical and commercial minds with the ability to support customers in more than 110 countries. Together, they share insights, use the latest technologies, and apply advanced business practices to speed their customers' delivery of important therapies to patients. And now, I'd like to introduce your speakers for today's webinar. Marie Ems joined Syneos Health in 2016 and has spent the past 3 years supporting both clinical and commercial clients with their patient engagement needs. Marie's passion lies in enabling client sites to best support their patients through the clinical journey, from initial awareness through consent to compliance and adherence. She has worked on a wide variety of tumor types across pediatric and geriatric populations. And in her role as head of patient engagement, she's responsible for developing engagement programs to support patient recruitment and retention globally across all Syneos Health studies. And secondly, as strategist of integration for Syneos Health, Drew Glenn is charged daily with championing data science and media integration between clinical and commercial projects. Built on an entirely new engagement model, Drew helps drive an integrated omni-channel approach to deliver the clinical trial faster with less risk, backed by a more data-driven approach. Most recently, Drew was an innovation strategist with Syneos Health, championing innovative thinking and doing through extensive research and closely following shifting expectations. And finally, Angela Hurst entered oncology nursing at Christie Hospital in Manchester and ultimately became the lead breast cancer research nurse at the Royal Preston Hospital. Angela was a site lead within IQVIA's Access to Patients program before becoming their lead oncology feasibility manager, responsible for large and complex opportunities. Angela also has extensive experience gained in the commercial setting as an oncology product manager for a range of portfolios for Fresenius Kabi. Angela is currently the Director of Site and Patient Access, responsible for Catalyst Oncology and Ophthalmology Networks, building and maintaining strong relationships with sites and creating ecosystems to predict the successful delivery of clinical trials. And now, it's with my pleasure to hand the microphone over to your first speaker for today, and that's Marie Ems. Marie.
Great, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. To set the stage for what we'll be talking about today, some of you may be looking at the next slide. Sorry, Angela, you can move forward. Thank you. Some of you may be actually looking at the slide in front of you, encouraged by the statistic in the middle there actually being as high as it is. Unfortunately, the percentage of oncology patients participating in clinical trials even now is still remarkably low, That 8.1% is actually from a recently cited 2019 statistic from the Journal of the National Cancer Institute. And I'm sure as many of you are familiar, that's actually far higher than the more commonly cited 3%, which I know many of us have known over the past few years. Nonetheless, 8% is still an incredibly low number and really reflects the challenges that we all face today when we support our sponsors in clinical trials. This low rate is often attributed to access issues specifically, including the availability of trials for whether it's a specific cancer type or the stage of disease, or even more likely the strict eligibility criteria. However, there are a number of other factors that you can see surrounding the statistic which really contribute to this, including heavy patient burden, patient misconceptions concerning research, lack of awareness from both patients and physicians, and also failing to reach patients at the right time in their treatment journey. And I think it really is a vicious circle. Patients rely on their physicians to inform them of what their options might be, which ultimately may include research. Meanwhile, sites themselves often seem to wait for the ideal patient to walk through the door at the right time. In other therapeutic categories, we often work with sites to ensure that they're more focused on really finding the ideal study patient. And in something like depression or diabetes, this really does make total sense. But when we look at oncology, given the low number of cancer patients who actually participate in clinical trials in the first place, the ideal patient is really rarely seen. So it's no wonder that oncology studies experience the significant delays that they do. So what can be done? And if we move to the next slide, really this kind of sets the stage for today's webinar. We've really constructed it around the hypothesis that we can all help sponsors improve enrollment rates and study timelines, really by understanding the patient pathway and helping sites to reach patients at the right time. My colleague Drew Glenn will talk about the Syneos health approach and the sources we use internally within Drew's data science team, and how this feeds into improved site selection, and then to help with the creation of the robust patient pathways that I'll come on to talk about later. And my colleague Angela will do a deeper dive into site selection and really discuss those factors we should consider when selecting sites. As I said, I'll bring it back to the patient at the end and looking at what more we can do to support patient enrollment. So with that being said, I'm going to hand over to Drew, who's really going to take you through the data science piece first.
Yes, thank you, Marie, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. In order to meet patients where they are along that journey that Marie just kind of described, we really need to understand that journey in more detail. And really what we try to do is understand how that journey impacts site identification and patient recruitment. And we really try and take it from any patient burdens that we may exist within an oncology trial, any barriers to the enrollment or delays that may happen, and really work towards an enhanced design, something that's more observed and monitored, and that looks at all the strategic operations. In order to do that, we really find that a data-driven approach is the right way. And it'll fuel a patient-centric study design by really understanding and digging deep to find and profile the right patients, and then really surround those sites with the best support possible. In order to create data-driven solutions, on the next slide you'll see, you guessed it, we need data. And nothing happens with the science in the middle of the diagram you're looking at without the right data. There are 4 silos that sources that we go to when it comes to looking for data. On the left-hand side, the first silo that we look through is our proprietary data. Syneos is armed with 2 proprietary data companies, Adheris Health and Syndicated Research. Adheris Health is data in the pharmacy from over 2.2 billion prescriptions across the United States. Syndicated Research is decades of tracking longitudinal data for drug and diagnosis data at an ICD-10 level, as well as HCP and DTC promotional activity. And our third proprietary is really working with our clients to understand what data they already have in-house and how can we leverage that to utilize in our analysis to make it even richer. The second source that we go to is at the top, our third-party data. We currently have relationships with 3 different vendors, Trinetics, Komodo, and Optum, and I'll go into those in the next slide in 1 second. The third source we go to is our public data. While this sometimes needs a little bit more mining, and cleaning to make sure that it's useful in our analysis. Whenever we can go to the CDC or the NHS to grab public data, that's another source we go to. And when we don't have data available, sometimes in remote parts of the world where patient data isn't available, we do have a full research team here at Syneos Health that looks at custom data through interviews, surveys, experiments, scraping, and modeling. So now that we have a little bit of an overview of what data sources we go to, on the next slide, you'll see a breakdown of the 5 sources that we go to most often, called our dynamic assembly platform. Our first is on the left, I'll go from left to right, is our Adheres Health company, looking at pharmacy claims, over 14 different chains, over 12,000 different pharmacies within there, covering 60 million people. Some of the applications we use with our Adheres Health team is really understanding how we can better adhere to medications. Within an oncology trial, we glean information to understand how transactions are happening, what information is getting to whom within that pathway. The second is Trinetics. Trinetics is a vendor partner of ours, and they look at healthcare organization EMR level data. There's over 145 different healthcare organizations that the data rests within under our contract. This covers 73.7 million lives, and we're able to utilize their platform to understand treatment pathways, treatment outcomes, compare cohorts. It really gets us into the data to understand patient populations. Optum is our third. This covers medical claims, over 170 million lives across 527,000 medical doctors. This is a great source to start to understand what sites and the PIs that might be most relevant to a study based on ICD-10s. Our newest is Komodo Health. Komodo Health looks across 300 million patients. 98% of HCPs are included, 15 million daily encounters, and it also starts to get into our payers as well. And our last is our promo encounters. This is our syndicated research group, and this looks across our ICD-10s for drug diagnosis level data. We can see what specialties, that we can see the types of payers that they're going towards, as well as promo and patient, promotional and patient DTC level engagements. Once we have the right data sets, really the next question is, what do we do with that data? So on the next slide, I'll start to talk about some of the solutions that we bring to clinical trials that gets to understanding that patient pathway better. The next slide, you can see there are 6 different variables that we start to look at within patient profiling. Angela, if you could go to the next one for me. Thank you. So patient-centric trials begin with understanding those patients. While there are a lot of different things that we can do from an analysis standpoint, these 6 are where we start. The first is geographically, creating maps of patients and adding layers, showing sites, investigators, referring physicians, any other points of interest to really hone in where is our population at within the world. The second, we profile patients along key demographic dimensions, uncovering potential areas. Behavioral segmentation, informing recruitment and retention tactics. For example, phase 1 versus a phase 4, a grade 1 versus a grade 4 oncology trial. That patient's going through a lot of different behavioral journey. So we really want to understand what those pieces are to really help understand how do we best set up patient engagement. In the top right, we can also look at understanding and collect patients' feedback on protocol to better understand site accessibility, burden factors, or any other psychological dimensions. And the last 2, when we profile patients, we look at their therapy attitudes, understanding their journey to better understand where they are at in the healthcare system, what barriers exist, and really understanding what tactics we need to bring forward to engage them and retain them the best. On the next slide, once we understand where the patients are and a little bit more about their journey, we really turn our efforts to understanding where those patients are in relativity to the sites. We really want to de-risk any factors that may come up in order to set up the engagement for the user experience to be as optimal as possible. Well, again, there are several different things we can look at when it comes to helping our site ID and feasibility teams. The 6 things that we do the most often are mapping the prevalence of qualified patients within site radius. Let's make sure that the sites that we are considering are within our population. And if they're not, we really need to understand how we can remove any barriers so that the sites that we have chosen where the patients are, they can get to it most easily. We look at local demographics, evaluating anything, understanding the potential access barriers due to income, employment, ownership, children, to make it as easy as possible. The third thing we look at is referability, availability. We also tap into our HCP networks to understand how we can leverage existing relationships where HCPs have these patients now so that they can be easily referred into trials. Any traffic or transit, mapping local patterns, options to the site to make sure that it's easily accessible. Any local competition to make sure that we are setting up and differentiating our messaging when it comes to patient engagement. And then looking at any site reviews to analyze potential problem areas to help remove those barriers. And now to take a deeper dive into selecting and priming sites, I will turn this over to my colleague, Angela Hurst, who is our Director of Site and Patient Access Group.
Thank you, Drew, and welcome everybody. As you've kind of got a feel already, the approach that we take at Syneos Health is heavily dependent on data. And we believe that this is a fluid process and a continuous cycle of reviewing, verifying, understanding, and then applying. So as with all opportunities that come to any CRO, the very beginning of a process of what does a good site look like must have a study design in mind, or a concept, or a final protocol even. So the data-driven approach takes into consideration the kind of type of centre, the correct patient profile, the right treatment pathway that the patient may be on, and all of this is going on in a very, very quick, fast turnaround way. Once we kind of do a deeper dive into what does a good site look like, we start to go into site selection. So as you can see from the circle here, we've got quite a few areas that we drill down into. So verifying the data given by sites, understand the target patient population, awareness of pending amendments, maintenance phase supported, expectations on requirements up front, understand the patient's journey, and feedback on the challenging parts of the protocol. And so for today's purpose, I'm going to focus on the 3 highlighted circles here. I'm more than happy in the Q&A section to talk about any of those other areas. So when we verify the data given by sites, as with all things feasibility, we do still rely on the expertise that our investigators and our MDT, that be study coordinators, nurses, do give us on study design, especially in early phases of design, where we can have an influence with our clients to really develop a protocol that will go in line with what a patient's journey is. We all know that if the more that the protocol deviates from a standard of care approach, that the less likely that the recruitment is going to be successful. And to Marie's point earlier, where 8.1% of patients go into oncology trials, the better the study design, the better the patient recruitment, and that all comes from verifying the data given by sites, and that would be, for example, standard of care. Once we've got the site up and running and we've looked at all of the aspects, the logistics, the pros and the cons, the maintenance phase support is where I believe Syneos Health comes into its own. So all of our site staff that have contact with the sites for oncology studies are oncology trained, and this maintenance phase support can really kind of help and assist more of a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach to any challenges that might come up in the market. We all know how fast-paced and dynamic and fluid the oncology arena is at the moment. And so the sharing of information, we believe, help prevent any kind of walls to recruitment that may come up. And these preventative measures could be something that we take into consideration, that the protocol may have an amendment soon. So we work really closely with the site to make sure that that journey hasn't changed in any way. And also resourcing. So we all are very aware of the resourcing has peaks and troughs. So if we're working in that maintenance phase in a really close way, we can almost identify where those bottlenecks might be with the patient's journey through the protocol. And that in turn also gives us a really good working relationship with sites, because the relationship's there, the trust is there, and also when we need parts of the protocol to be delivered in a certain way for a certain time, it's a really good relationship that we have two-way, that the sites now understand that we need the data in a certain way with a certain level of integrity and a certain timeline. And that's how we kind of work through that area right up until the end of study. None of this obviously can happen until we understand the patient's journey. And for me, having been an oncology nurse, when I'm looking at opportunities and I'm looking at protocols and site profiling, I will always take into consideration the patient's journey at the very beginning, even before I've had a look at locations, geography, anything like that. So when you kind of look at a process that the patient has to go through, the typical things that we would take into consideration, and I know Marie is going to go into this in more detail later, is the patient's burden, what's expected of the patient, does it deviate from standard of care, and to Drew's point, at what stage in their cancer diagnosis are they? It may be a very different journey for a grade 1 than it would be for a grade 4, for example, and that will drive emotional reactions to studies, to investigators, to whether they actually want to participate or not. So as we go into the next slide, the site selection process is multifaceted and multi-layered, and depending on where and how the sites are involved with Syneos Health will really depend on how much work is involved for them at the very beginning, during the middle, and at the end. So I've already kind of touched on the expert site profiling that we take into consideration in the pre-award stage. And this has many layers. And it could be that if I was working on an opportunity, I would reach out to my medical colleagues within Syneos and get some understanding of what the market was like, what their feelings were with their colleagues who are still practicing physicians. And indeed, we do actually have medics that are practicing physicians within Syneos, and it's a great source of help for us. More so, I think, at the moment, with all the changes that are going on with the oncology study designs, that really novel and new markers are coming out all of the time, that, you know, we get a study design and we have to go and really dig down into where are these markers being taken, who is taking these markers, and that drives site selection, for example. The initial site contact, when we've been talking about what does a good site look like, this is the profiling that happens in the very beginning. And once we've identified the sites that would fit really well to the protocol, then we obviously make the initial site contact. And this is where we gauge interest. So right at the very beginning, we're really looking at, can this site work with us and work in an area that's maybe difficult. So for example, you know, in the US, we've got community and academic institutions. So it might be that we're taking into consideration that the community institutions may refer their patients into an academic, or vice versa. So the protocol interest is really where the fun starts, because we might think that the site's great, but actually the investigators, this is probably the first time that they're looking at the protocol. And the key areas that we really want to drill down into is the patient pathway. For me, it's one of the most important. The resourcing and the infrastructure, it can kind of be worked with and around. But if we're deviating from patients' pathways and deviating from a positive patient experience, then we're really going to struggle later on down the line with kind of enrollment, but more importantly retention, because that's obviously what we are all aiming for, which is why Syneos Health works so closely with sites in the maintenance phase. Individual follow-up. So this, I would say, having worked in a gen med area and oncology, I would say this is probably key in really early phase, complicated study design oncology studies. This is where our medics within Syneos Health really come into their own, because we can generate some discussions, not in a formal advisory board way, but a real kind of colleague to colleague. How do we feel that this would help? What do we need to change? What is it that's going to make a difference here? And that's when we can kind of take that information, as well as what Drew would collate, as well as what Marie's team would collate, and we pull it all together. And each layer of that data kind of package, if you like, is just as important as the rest. But the real medic to medic information is key in really developing how successful we're going to be with our site selection and site delivery. And then finally, we have, gosh, it's all going pear-shaped here. And finally, we have qualification. So qualification, depending on whether the site's worked with us a lot in the past, whether it's worked with us within the last 12 months in the past, or whether it's a brand new site that we need to bring into our network, then every site will have a qualification of some sort. So it can either be on site or can be a phone validation. And this is where we really confirm all of these layers in the process that we've talked about. We really confirm that the site staff are motivated, they have an understanding, the investigator is bought in, motivated, and really wanting to work with Syneos Health to make the success, the delivery and of the study. Now, these four processes here don't actually have to all happen 1, 2, 3, 4, and they can happen in any sequence whatsoever. So flexibility in our site selection process is critical. So, for example, if we were working with a site that had done a previous study with a very similar study design, with a very similar patient population, then we probably wouldn't need to do all the expert site profiling, that we may be able to go to initial site contact and jump to qualification, because we already know that the site has the ability. We just want to know that they've got their interest, and then we jump straight into qualification. So we can streamline that whole process depending on how involved and closely we work with our sites. So with that said, I think we're going to go back into the patient's emotional pathway, and I'm going to hand back over to Marie, who you heard from at the beginning of the presentation.
Great, thanks Angela. So as Angela just talked about site selection and really looking at how we best support sites, let's really then start talking about the patient pathways. And really often, as we have shown at the top here, we often focus on the treatment pathway, and that's really shown here under experimental engagements. Symptoms present, we seek advice, we get a diagnosis, we plan and look at how we're going to manage that disease. Of course, that's just one part of the patient pathway. If we actually look at the parallel pathway running along the bottom, the emotional pathway really plots that emotional state of the patient, the attitudes that they may have both towards their disease, their own healthcare, towards research, and really what happens to them across the whole life cycle of their disease. When we actually look at this pathway, it's very difficult to really take one piece on its own. They don't necessarily run in a vertical fashion. For example, some patients may not actually experience symptoms until quite late in their disease, or they might have they might be further along in stage than they actually realise. Therefore, at the point of diagnosis, they may still be working through that fear, the worry, the confusion, the denial, the despair, the distress. It all racks one on top of the other. How do we know this? And I think this really kind of comes from the social listening, the other data that Drew's team provides, and also looking at advocacy groups. From a Syneos Health perspective, we actually work a lot with advocacy groups to really understand the patient population, how they see their patients plotting through this pathway, both from the treatment journey and obviously from the emotional journey. When patients are seeking advice on a particular symptom or set of symptoms, and that's really shown at the start here on the left side of the slide, it's obvious that they reach out to friends, to family, to the internet. If you tell people that you work for a clinical research organisation, people suddenly decide that you're the doctor and you're the person that they come to if they have a particular question about their own health. Social listening and other data sources that Drew's team provide really show us that if you go online to look for information, it really can be a bit of a minefield. For all of us on this call, we're somewhat lucky that we really have a better idea of where to start looking under these types of circumstances. Unfortunately, patients are not so fortunate. So while they may have started with the internet search with their friends, their families, by the time they reach a specialist physician, realizing that there might be something wrong, or it might be that they've had a routine checkup and they've kind of questioned a particular symptom that they have, they may have all kinds of confusion and not really knowing what's truth versus fiction. Again, this kind of confusion can lead to often more internet searches or to seek a second opinion to confirm a diagnosis, since patients at this point are still really in that point of disbelief. It's that denial, that despair that actually something, very serious is wrong with them. And I think when you give patients a cancer diagnosis, from the sites that we've engaged with and our own Catalyst Oncology sites, that we know there are more than 200 types of primary disease. So it's unfortunate that still in 2019, some patients are diagnosed and can still die from cancer of unknown primary origin, irrespective of the imaging and technology advances that we've made in recent years. So if you tell someone that you have cancer, that's huge. It's something all of us dread, but from our perspective, we need to decide when's the most optimal time for sites to start thinking about how to best engage their patients to start talking about research. For many patients, the way they give themselves hope is that they want to plan. Moving forward, being able to take that first step to some kind of treatment option or some kind of disease management option really does give them hope. Patients are dependent on their healthcare team, not just for that treatment support, but also for that emotional support, as well as their families, friends, and the wider cancer community. It really does start with having that right healthcare team in place, and really to ensure that they understand what's happening to them, that they understand that, as kind of like, as Angela kind of alluded to earlier, that when we talk about patient burden and we talk about the burden of a particular trial on a patient, quite often we kind of sometimes ignore just what burden that disease holds in itself. If we look at the number of hospital visits that patients have to make if they're on an approved treatment regime, sometimes it can be just as time intensive as for those patients who are on a research study. When we kind of look at, once we get to that point of planning, if patients are really looking at research as an option, it's then that they really start to kind of widen that sphere. Again, they'll go back into the digital community. Their friends, their families will also do that kind of deeper dive. That's definitely something that Drew's team has helped us really look at in recent studies, of just looking at how much deep dive patients and family members really do go. More recently, we've seen that a lot of communities now exist on Reddit, and not just patients themselves talking on Reddit, but also physicians and other healthcare professionals themselves see themselves in Reddit now, really to help patients, which really just goes to show the extent that the internet can really go to providing patients with that support from the healthcare community. And of course, it'd be remiss of me not to mention advocacy groups here. It's really at this point that patients really do lean on their local advocacy chapter for support and the many online communities that exist today. And obviously with a lot of these online communities, they are closed. Patients can take comfort to know that not everyone is going to be reading every little detail about their treatment or about the journey that they've gone through. So when we actually look overall at this emotional pathway, it really is quite complex, and it's dependent on the particular tumour type, the particular phase of disease that patients are going through, determining where they kind of like plot as they go through this journey. Of course, unfortunately, what ends up often happening with many oncology patients is if treatment fails or if their tumours metastasize, that journey begins all the way over to the left again, and they almost start from scratch again with that perhaps disbelief or that fear and worry that actually the cancer's come back. And this is something that we really do think long and hard about from a Syneos Health perspective, that, you know, at the end of the day, patients are real people. They're not a statistic. It's not a number that we report to our clients every week to kind of show that we're making progress through that in meeting our end goal. We're really working with real people, and they're people who really do need a lot of support and going through a highly stressful disease. And to kind of bring a real life example in here, and I know that many of my colleagues will know that a lot of the times I always tell stories, and today is really no different. A neighbour of mine has been living with multiple myeloma for about the past 5 years. He's a record producer. He has his own kind of like mini kind of studio, and 5 years ago his knowledge was about the science and medical side of life was really pretty much nil, non-existent. Due to the nature of his disease, and, you know, bearing in mind this is multiple myeloma, this journey for him has been pretty much wrapped up in failure. So far, since 2014, he's failed 6 clinical trials. He recently started his 7th. Yet, interestingly enough, he finds the science absolutely fascinating. He's got a really thorough understanding of his disease, as you might expect by this point, bearing in mind he's been living with it for 5 years. His support group consists of friends, family, neighbours, and more importantly, his healthcare team at Mount Sinai. And they've been instrumental in really helping ensure that he's remained committed to finding a potential treatment option, or should I say a potential maintenance option, which really has helped with his enthusiasm and focus. Now, don't get me wrong, I think this is where we kind of have to be realistic, and he's certainly realistic in his prognosis, and he knows at some point soon his options will run out. But it is that fine balance for him that through research he's been given 5 additional years. And actually, in those options, it's been very much his healthcare team coming to the table time and time again with new options for him to try. So I think when we actually look at the role that healthcare professionals play, when we actually look in the middle of this slide here, we've got so many other factors that actually kind of move between helping that patient really through that journey and helping them find the information that they need. But actually it's critical. We're also looking at how we can best support our sites and the wider healthcare community in actually making sure that patients find out about clinical trials and they actually see research as a potential disease management option for them. So taking this forward, how do we really reach patients? And looking at the next slide, when we actually look at engaging patients, and especially in those cancer types where patients do have more options, and I'm not sure if it's a delay on my side, but if we can move forward to the next slide. When we're actually looking at tumour types such as breast or prostate, or actually even multiple myeloma, really it is important to think about how we best engage patients. And often it's those groups of patients with some of those tumour types that are actually easier to engage. And again, with the disease pathway, thinking about patients at an earlier stage of disease with treatment options, they're not going to be as open to seeking research perhaps as some of those patients who maybe have failed first or second line, or if there are patients with a specific genotype which is known not to respond well to current treatment options, with the right education support, they will be more willing to think about research. And that again comes back to how well sites themselves and other oncologists speaking to their patients are really able to talk through research options with patients. So when we actually look at the kind of that circle of influencing factors, I think, we can look at the ones on the right-hand side, the stage of cancer, the aggressiveness. Sometimes those are, well, they're really not factors that we can influence. But when we're actually overlaying this with the role of the caregiver, how many times are patients actually having to go back to the clinic for follow-up care, looking at the influence of the sphere of influence from family members, that emotional hub of where they're actually going to find information. This can actually all contribute hugely to how patients can make that informed decisions to participate in research once it's on the table for them for discussion. But in order to be able to really proactively do this, we need to be able to provide sites with the tools and support to both reach patients, but actually know how to talk to them. And I think, unfortunately, for many of us who may have had a parent or a family member who's gone through this, we know that a lot of physicians, unfortunately, are not the best communicators, and providing tools to help them manage those discussions with patients are often invaluable. And it's really about making that discussion easier to have with those patients. So let's move on to the next slide and really talk about, looking at a more tactical level, what this support might look like. And for many sites, they really do value a lot of these tactics that we see on the slide in front of us today. It really starts as some of the really simple sharing of information about the disease, about treatment options, information about clinical trials, through the typical patient materials you might provide your site. It's also thinking about sharing information with referral networks and how sites interact with their referring colleagues within the healthcare system to identify patients who may actually be eligible for specific protocols. We know more recently, well, certainly over the past few years, a lot of our European sites love to share information with referring colleagues through WhatsApp. A lot of the local hospitals have a WhatsApp platform, so being able to give them infographics and bite-sized information that makes it more makes it easier for them to share is something that we can kind of like remove that site burden and kind of give them that information easily packaged for them. I talked a lot earlier about how difficult it is to find the right information on the internet, and we know that ultimately we will go to the internet to find information. So it's important that when we actually look at digital awareness campaigns, that we're deploying the right digital campaign, whether it's search, social, a mix, to ensure that we're driving patients to a study website where they can find that information they need, and if appropriate, connect them with a participating site. I think the one area that we often think about in recruitment is very much focused on the patient, and how do we actually find patients during that point in their journey to get them to a site quicker. And the one piece that we shouldn't really forget about is the site. To support sites in their understanding of the trial itself, we need to think about their needs from an educational perspective on the protocol. And specifically here, I'm kind of alluding to the circle called Talking Protocols. From a Syneos Health perspective, we have a very talented clin ed team that will create talking protocols designed really to help sites navigate often complex protocols, helping to check their own understanding through quizzes, through online surveys, and actually help us ensure that the barrier to recruitment isn't a lack of understanding of the protocol. And I think to many of you, this may sound obvious, But I think for the number of failing sites that I've worked with and just picked up the phone and said, please tell me, what is the issue that you're having? So how can we help you? Often a high percentage of sites not enrolling patients really does come down to protocol confusion. And in particular, it's in oncology. And that really shouldn't surprise us, given what we know about oncology protocols, and especially as we kind of move on to really looking at the very specific genotypes of tumours that more often than not, a lot of our protocols are now asking for. So from when you actually look at that tactical mix, I would urge you really to also think about the sites as well, and really think about the support that we should be giving our sites in ensuring that when they see a patient, they're able to really talk about the protocol and they actually feel confident. And I think that's one of the areas that we see a lot, that if sites do not feel confident that they know the protocol well, they're really not going to talk to a patient about it. So with that being said, I think that the three of us, and especially myself, we've probably talked for long enough today. I'm going to bring us back to the conclusion for us, and really kind of looking at that next slide, that it really kind of does come down to 4 points. I hope you've seen that through today, through understanding that patient pathway, it really does enable all of us to better identify the right sites for clinical trials and help develop targeted patient recruitment strategies. It really does help sponsors avoid the delays in waiting for patients to arrive by chance, because really, patients are not going to walk in to a site, no matter how much the site thinks that might happen. And that patient pathway analysis really helps us all disrupt that journey by getting a patient to a site quicker at the right time, which will ultimately result in higher enrolment rates and shorter timelines. And I think that's what all of us today are really looking for. I think I've been working in patient recruitment now for nearly 20 years, and I think rather than study timelines getting shorter, we actually definitely see them getting longer, and it's the responsibility for all of us collectively to really think about how we can shorten that, how can we optimize this, and actually moving forward help our clients get drugs to market quicker for the patients that we want to help. So with that being said, I'm going to bring this to a close. Before I open the floor to questions, I would like to point out that there are 2 handouts available for you today. It's available through the control panel that you have. There's a white paper that actually supports this webinar, and there's also a recent article that was published in SCRS really about the same topic. So if you are interested and looking for more information about this, I would encourage you all to download these 2 handouts. I think now we've probably got just under 15 minutes left for questions, so I'm happy to open the floor. Thank you, everyone.
All right, well, thank you so much for that presentation. Lots of interesting and very useful stuff you present today, so thank you very much for that. I would now like to invite our audience to continue sending in their questions and comments right now using that questions window. For this, of course, is the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we've already received some questions here, so let's get started. Our first question, could you give us an example of how digital awareness programs can be utilized optimally without flooding the sites with ineligible patients? Is there a need for a pre-screening process through a call center, for example? So I'll leave that open to the floor.
Sure, and I can take this one. This is Marie. So yeah, I mean that's a good question, and I'm sorry I probably didn't kind of go into enough detail about that. So I think for any kind of digital campaign that we work on, it's really important to really think about, again, it comes back to site burden. When we send patients to websites, any Syneos Health protocol, we will always use a screener. There'll always be a digital online screener, but oftentimes, dependent on the needs of the protocol, we will do a secondary screen with a live call center, and that really enables some really enables kind of a second level of pre-screening to take place before that patient is referred onto the site. Because once we get to the site level, we really want to make sure that the most appropriate patients have been referred to them, because we know that if the sites are flooded with lots of referrals that they know are not going to meet the eligibility criteria, then, you know, that's shame on us for doing our job poorly. So, yeah, I think that from a Syneos Health perspective, definitely always think about your pre-screening, and also think about that second tier of pre-screening before it gets to the site.
Excellent. All right, thank you for that. Let's move to another question here. Can you elaborate on what you do in those instances where the data isn't readily available to analyze, such as more remote places in Europe or China, for example?
Yeah, hi, this is Drew. I can take that one. And I should have gone into a little bit more detail across our dynamic assembly. When it comes to data globally, we first turn to our Trinetics relationship. We have 8 different countries, including outside of the US, that we have over, that represents over 10 million patients that we can dive into. And that's where we go first and foremost. Obviously, there's a whole world around that. And when we don't have the data readily available, we tap into our custom research group. Our custom research group is able to run surveys, do live interviews, with the right stakeholders to mine that data. And it's really understanding, you know, where patient data isn't available, understanding what doctors and healthcare professionals treat the disease in question, what patients do they have, what's their willingness to refer to a trial or to have their patients involved in a trial, and any barriers as well to participating in that trial. So that's really where we go for data outside of the US.
Okay, good to know. Thank you for that. Drew, as a follow-up, if we go way back to the beginning of this presentation, around slide 5, could you define for us what you mean by scraping?
Yes, and sorry to be a little bit elusive in that. The scraping really refers to, you know, there's all kinds of data and information decentralized on websites and all over digital properties across the globe. And what we're able to do sometimes is we set up programs with set parameters of things we want to know. And we set that program out into the World Wide Web to come back with everything that we're interested in finding on those digital properties. So it's a way to gather data that maybe we may be able to glean insights to help us with any of the different things that we talked about.
Right, okay. Thank you very much for that. Moving forward to another question here. This audience member writes, I can see that this would be useful during study feasibility. Are sponsors buying these useful tools to help them inform protocol development or at some point prior to study launch?
Yeah, and sorry, this is Marie. Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, there was just a bit of static on the line. Yeah, I can absolutely take this one. I mean, that's actually a good question because, yeah, in a nutshell, yes, absolutely, sponsors are both seeing the value and are definitely investing in this kind of approach on many protocols that we're working with them on at the moment. I would also say that when you actually look at the way that a lot of pharmaceutical companies are kind of moving towards how they kind of build out their own internal teams, a lot of them are now kind of like arming themselves with data scientists themselves, which I think really reflects the need for the data part and the analytics that really was missing from this kind of part of the industry for many years. So yeah, I think that it's not going to be something that you would use on absolutely every protocol, but definitely where there's a complex protocol, if there are, you know, lots of different countries involved, that you're looking for a very specific patient population and it might be something that, you know, that the sponsor haven't had a lot of experience with before, then it is definitely something that they are very willing to invest in. And I think the reports that they get really do then help them kind of then share that information onto their commercial colleagues, because I think for the patient part of the data that we collect, while it's, you know, invaluable to the work that we do on the clinical side, it actually also helps transition onto the commercial side of pharmaceutical companies very well. And that's also kind of something else for you all to think about.
All right, thank you very much for that, Marie. Another question here. How much turnaround time and what kind of considerations go into the protocol feedback and review process from data learned on patient perspectives on difficult, so time commitment intensive, specifically early phase protocols, to improve patient recruitment and continued positive participation? Furthermore, are there additional budget considerations for participant participation reimbursement considered? That's a very long question there.
Yeah, this is Angela. So I'll break that into two. So the first part is the turnaround time and what kind of considerations. That generally really depends on where we're brought into the overall process with the client. So we are continually working with clients to get into the very beginning of the thought process, the real early engagement, and we have some fantastic executive leadership who really work with our clients, who draw on the internal expertise within Syneos and then feed that back. So in the ideal world, we would be engaged very early on, and we would feed back the patient's perspective, and we would all work as a multidisciplinary team. So Marie would be involved, operations would be involved, the medics would be involved, and we would really try and navigate and educate the client into what does that journey look like for the patient. As I alluded to before, if it deviates too much from standard of care, we really reduce our recruitment, and also when we reduce recruitment, it also means that patients don't get access to the drugs. So we really try and keep that funnel, if you like, really nice and open. Now, if we're brought in at the very end and it's all signed, sealed and delivered, and we have concerns over the patient pathway, then we will really try and work with the clients to make them understand that there may be challenges ahead. We also will then develop an educational kind of program that we work with sites if that is the actual design of the study. That's not an ideal world at all, because what we're trying to do is move a whole market because of one protocol that was written in a specific way, and we all know how that ends. So to answer it is, we have as much time as we possibly can in the very beginning, because we're working with clients in early engagement. When we're working with our partners like SCRS, we will always try and get some patient feedback as well, and that's when Reed's team also come into a level of expertise, because we do have access to patient forums and things like that, and we will always try and get that feedback, because for me personally, it's just as important as investigator feedback. And then the additional budget, that also is a negotiation that starts at the very beginning and the middle and the end, and it's a continuous cycle. So if we believe that there is heavy patient burden, then we will also open up those negotiations with the client as well, and ask them and work with them to kind of get an understanding of what's an acceptable level for a patient to participate.
All right, thank you for that. Let's squeeze in one last question, albeit multi-part. This audience member writes, there's a link between the prevalence of a certain patient population and trust. Is there any data to suggest that we can build trust with specific ethnicities? And speaking with sites, materials and advocacy groups may not be as effective if they are not registered with a group or exposed to materials. And can you tell us about how you drive diversity through clinical trials at Syneos?
Yeah, this is Drew. I'll take that one, and I know I'll pass to you, Marie, as well, because I'm sure you have some thoughts. From my perspective, there's two pieces that we look at. Number one, we do have demographic data in-house that really showcases the diversity of whatever stakeholder group we're looking at. That's either HCP, patients, caregivers. We do have that in-house. The second thing that we look at is social listening. So once we understand what patients or what stakeholders we're looking for, we can go to the social aspect of the digital world to understand what conversations are happening, to really understand what messages are going to resonate best, what channels are going to be the most optimal, to really engage all the different patient groups, all the different stakeholders that might be part of the trial. And Marie, I'll let you add anything additional.
Sure, thanks, Drew. And I think, you've said it very well, Drew. I think the only thing that I would add to that is, I think when we look at advocacy, I can't stress this enough, but advocacy should not just be seen as a one tactical line item in the budget for another route for patient recruitment. I think for advocacy, it has to be a long-term relationship, and it takes an investment. I think, only yesterday I was saying that advocacy is really a marriage. It's not a one-night stand. And if you treat your advocacy as a true partner, then they are going to know about the trials. They are going to be more bought into the work that your sponsor's doing. And it really has to be a relationship that continues way beyond that 12 or 18 month enrollment window. It has to be a long-term relationship that for many of you that you hold and you continue, and the sponsors that continue far into commercialization of the drug itself.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. We have reached the end of the question and answer portion of this webinar. But if you do have any additional questions you didn't get to ask, you can write in to Marie. Marie, there is her email address up on your screen right now, so you can send in those questions to her. I'm sure she'd be happy to answer. And if we weren't able to attend to your questions today that you've already sent in, the team at Syneos Health may try to follow up with you after the webinar. Well, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event, and a survey window will be popping up on your screen shortly. Your participation is appreciated, as it'll help us improve our further webinars. Now, I'm just sending you a link in your chat box. You can use that to go back to where you registered for this event. The recording for this event will be available on that very same page when it's posted. And you can also send this and share it to your colleagues, and they'll be able to view that as well if they register for the event. So I hope you do that, and I'm sure you found that useful. Thank you everyone for attending today. Also, special thanks again to our speakers for today, Marie Ems, Drew Glenn, and Angela Hurst. We hope that you found this webinar informative today. Thanks, everyone.